Okay, so I think I'll start, if that's fine with you guys, okay? Good. Well, as you can tell, you're not entirely new to me. This community, the Agile community here in Ukraine and in Kiev, and I think it's the same. Some of you guys already know me. For those of you who don't, that's what I do. I work independently, always did, and I work as an organizational agile coach, whatever that means for you. So I work with large organizations, I mean, as large as the United Nations, the Food and Agriculture Organization, or very small IT companies. And what I mean is that I think I have a good understanding of the different dynamics in organizations because I've seen lots of them, lots of different kinds. And what I'd like to talk about today is agile leadership. And then again, we have heard Michael this morning talking about the importance of growing leaders so that they can create the right culture in which Agile may thrive. So Agile leadership in general is a very huge topic, very complex topic. Just look at the sheer amount of books on leadership that came out in the last 20 years, and you'll have a brief understanding of how complicated this stuff is. So, of course, I'm not going to give you any silver bullet today. I'm going to focus on a few things which I believe are relevant in an Agile environment. And there are, of course, many others. And you'll have the opportunity to find out by yourself. So, Agile. So what is Agile? Okay. First of all, let's start from the very beginning. Let's start from the basics. What is Agile? And you can give many definitions, but for me, Agile is knowing that you do not know. Okay? Knowing that you do not know. And at the same time, function. Function in an intelligent way. Okay? Being able to function in an environment in which you know that you don't know. So what is it that you do not know? Let me explain this in Kievan terms. If you guys are not familiar with Kievan, that's fine. That's a framework, a sense-making framework for understanding complexity and systems and so on. But let me give you an example. Now, let's say that one morning you want to go to work, you take your car, and the car doesn't start. Okay? So you turn the key, doesn't start. Okay? You try a couple of things, doesn't start. At the end of the day, what you do, you take your car, you take it to the mechanic, and then the mechanic will fix it. Now, when you bring your car to the mechanic, the guy does not know why your car is not functioning properly. Okay, he does not know, as you don't know. The difference is that he knows where to look for. Okay, that's the difference. He knows where to look because he understands this complicated system, which is a car, and he knows where to look. Okay, he knows what is unknown. Okay. So if your car is not starting, probably he will not check the tire pressure. Probably. Okay? Hopefully. Hopefully. Because he knows where to look. Okay? He knows what he doesn't know. But in complexity, we don't know what we don't know. And what I mean is, if someone comes to you and tells you that there is a particular species of butterflies that are now dying in the Amazon, and you are a biologist, well, the thing is, not only you don't know why the butterflies are dying, but you may not even know the causes, you may not even imagine the causes why the butterflies are dying, because it's a complex environment. So you don't know, you know that you don't even know that you don't know. Okay. And that's the kind of environment where we operate in Agile. And let me give you an example. If you put out on the market a new product, there is no way that you can predict in advance what will happen when the product goes on the market, because it's a complex system and there is no way of knowing which will be the causes that will generate a good or bad response to your product. There's no way of knowing until you try, right? Until you try. And agility also has many dimensions. Agility, for instance, can be technical agility, which means the technical practices that will support you when you work in an environment when you don't know what you don't know. Okay? For instance, continuous integration is a way of constantly probing your code base and making sure that you have no surprise. Okay? We have process agility, like Scrum. We have business agility, which is the ability to operate in the market in an agile way, But most of all, we have organizational agility. Organizational agility is this idea that everything is kept together if your organization is agile. It's kind of pointless to have a good process if people are just not working together in an agile way, right? So the question is, which kind of organizations support agile? Okay, and of course, there is one thing that is there are certain qualities, more than one thing. There are certain qualities of organizations that make them more agile than another. For instance, decentralized decision making. Meaning that if you start looking at your organization as a network, okay, in which things happen, and you want this network to be more responsive than, for instance, other kind of structures. Okay? Decentralizing decision making is very important, because when you centralize decision making, you create bottlenecks, right? There's a huge delay between when a problem is found and a decision is made, because it needs to go up the chain and then go down the chain again, for instance. Okay? So decentralized decision making, which means delegating power, which means trusting people, which means assuming that people will cooperate together and will share ideas and information. There's a lot of assumptions behind decentralizing the decision making. But that's one. There is another, which is continuous scanning of your system. And by scanning, I mean getting information from the system all the time. Storytelling is a wonderful way of scanning the complex system in an organization. For instance, the sense-making framework by Dave Snowden is a way for gathering information in a structured way, but this information is in the form of storytelling. And storytelling is something that we as humans have been doing for millennia, right? Okay. When we were in caves around campfires and we would tell stories to each other. And that's a wonderful way to get information from the system. So scan the system, learn, and then improve it, or even better, adapt. Right? So these are qualities of an agile, some qualities of an agile organization. And of course, the structure of your organization does have an impact. So the most common form of organizational structure today is, as you know, is the hierarchical structure. And that's very old. It comes from the idea that we can manage organizations in the same way that we manage a production chain. Okay? So organizations as machines. Okay? That's the idea behind a hierarchical structure. And as I've mentioned, probably it's not a good idea because you're not decentralizing decision making. Another form that you might be familiar with is the matrix organization, which I'm not really fond of, because that means that instead of having one hierarchy, you have two hierarchies, you twist one 90 degrees, you combine them, okay, and now you have a matrix, okay? And this has an interesting effect, like people having two bosses who don't talk with each other, okay, which is not exactly a good way of making decision making smooth, okay? Or now, these days, we are starting to see other forms of, I'm sorry, other forms of structural organization. Like I use the generic term tribes. I'm not implying tribal leadership here, which is another thing. I'm talking about groups of people that are highly independent and they coordinate with each other. Okay, and this could be holacracy, could be sociocracy, could be the Spotify model, whatever that is, because it changes constantly. So this kind of thing. But what is really important is the social structure. What is really important is the ability for people to operate in such a way that makes the organization agile. And Michael, this morning, here on this stage, mentioned the importance of having people over processes. Remember, people over processes, okay? And that was built into the Agile Manifesto. Okay, individuals and interactions over processes and tools has been there for 16 years, okay? We forget it all the time, or we decide to ignore it, okay? But it's been there all the time. So One thing I'd like to mention briefly before we move on, okay, that's very good that there's a clock over there, so I don't have to check the time here. One thing I would like to mention briefly is the difference between management and leadership. And the reason why I want to make this distinction is because I do believe that many of the perspectives that we have today about leadership are still heavily influenced by mental models that come from management. So I want to make, first of all, a clear distinction, or one possible distinction between management and leadership, and then we move on. So, I mean, if you look on the web, there are many sarcastic cartoons about the difference, between manager and leader, and there are also a lot of different formal definitions. I chose one for this talk. I chose the words of Seth Godin. This comes from a book called Tribes, and he simply explains that management is about manipulating resources to get a known job done. Makes sense to me. Remember, organizations as machines, okay? So in this context, probably resources also mean people. I never use the term resource for a person, but in this context, it could also mean that, but it could be any kind of resource. Time, money, whatever, okay, any kind of resource. So you manipulate resources to get a known job done. Problem is, we don't know what we don't know, okay? So there is no known job done, okay? Of course, this is done by authority, because we have a hierarchical structure. Leadership, I believe, and I like the words of Seth Godin, leadership is about creating a change that you believe in. Leadership is about bringing about change in a direction in which you believe. Okay? So there is a component of intention in leadership, of even better, of intent. There is something that I see, there is something that I believe is right, is good, and I want to go there, okay? And I want to bring about this change. And I need to bring about this change not by authority, if you're a leader, okay, but by influencing and interacting with other people. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is that managers have employees and leaders have followers. And following is a deliberate decision. It's not imposed. You decide to follow. You are not asked to follow or ordered to follow. And this distinction between leaders and followers will become handy in a couple of minutes when I will give a bit more information. So anyway, that's a distinction I wanted to make between management and leadership. Okay? Leadership is about bringing about change. Leadership is about influencing, cooperating. Leadership is about having followers who decide to follow you. They are not forced to. And this connects to accountability versus responsibility. I'll go very fast here. So in a hierarchical structure, if you have a boss and somebody tells you to do something, you become accountable for what you do, right? And accountable means that you need to give account of what happened, okay? So that's the concept of accountability. But responsibility, it's a different story. Responsibility is when you take responsibility, when you feel responsible. And if you want to bring about change, you want to feel responsible for the impact that this change will bring. Okay? So responsibility you can never put on someone. Real responsibility people can only take. Real responsibility. Okay? What you can put on people is pressure, but that's not responsibility. Okay? So why I'm talking about this? Because remember, I was talking about influencing people. By the way, to help you follow my reasoning, what I'm doing is I started from a very broad context. I started with a very simple question: what is Agile? And now I'm narrowing down. I'm kind of zooming in. Okay, so I started talking what is Agile, in which context Agile happens, which kind of organizations, and which kind of qualities in the organizations, organizational qualities, structures, what is responsibility, what is management. So I'm narrowing down. I'm zooming. Okay? So that's what I'm doing. So let's start talking about influencing people. So one thing about influencing people is that there is an assumption that people cannot communicate, and it's a wrong assumption, because if you look at these two guys, I mean, they're clearly communicating to me, right? I mean, they're giving clear messages to one another. They're giving a clear message, even though they don't talk, okay? They're giving a clear message to one another, okay? So what I'm saying is that it's impossible not to communicate. So what I'm saying is that every single word, every single act, and every single thought that you have has an influence on the outside context. Every single thought, word, and act. So you might be wondering, okay, so act and word I understand, so why thought? Well, because your thoughts determine your acts and words. Very simply, all right? And that means that asking the question, what is the ethics for me, and which kind of influence I want to bring about. So the question is, what is the ethics of being influential? That's a very good question to ask. Which kind of influence do I want to have around me? I've seen managers that are totally unaware of this thing. And awareness is another important thing, which I will describe a little bit more later. For instance, do you guys have ever seen managers that yell at people? Right? Okay. So which kind of message, which kind of influence, not the verbal direct message, which kind of subtle message are they giving? Okay. It's probably a message of creating fear, not trusting, power, privilege, blah, 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 blah. So you're creating a culture of privilege. I can yell at you, my friend, but you cannot, because I'm on stage now and you are not. Okay, that's a privilege. Okay, so it's the ethics of influencing people become extremely important if you want to be a good Agile leader. And so my next question is, what is Agile leadership? What is Agile leadership? Little piece of information, not this thing. Okay, this is definitely not a good example of Agile leadership. This is a kind of leadership that is full of old mental models, like the hero that saves the world, or someone who protects you, or someone who has a lot of power, or someone who works alone. Okay, all these mental models that come from management have nothing to do with leadership. Okay. So that's one thing, one thought I wanted to share with you. And when I go around and I do workshops on Agile leadership and so on, one of the things that I do is I ask people in the workshop, so what is an Agile leader for you? Who is an Agile leader for you? And they come up with this wonderful and beautiful description of a human being who I would marry regardless of the sex. I wouldn't care because he would be such a wonderful being. Oh, okay. So he's a good speaker, or she's a good speaker, understanding, he has the listening skills, is very empathic, he's not a dictator, emotional intelligence, is very sociable, has an open mind, it pulls people up, he's a visionary, is also humble, and he has critical sense. Okay. Okay, so if you meet someone like that, never let him go. Okay. Okay. So people have this idea that we would very much like to have leaders like that. I think that there's another question that is more important. And the question is, what kind of leader do you want to be? That's the real question that you should ask yourself, because that's the only thing that you can really change is yourself. You cannot change the leaders that are around you, but you can change yourself. So that's a good question. Which kind of leader do you want to be? Which kind of ethics do you want to bring with you when you influence others? Okay, that's a very good question, in my opinion. And so you see, I'm zooming in. Okay, now I'm talking about you. Okay, previously I was talking about what is Agile. Now I'm talking about you. So another thing about this kind of this idea of Agile leadership is this one. I believe that in a true, real, agile environment, everybody leads. In different ways, from time to time, okay? But everybody leads, okay? And that's a key point. Leadership is not an appointed position. Leadership is an act. And everybody leads in different ways, in different moments, with different influences. So everybody leads, which is why I asked you, which kind of leader do you want to be? Okay? And if you think more about this, if you think more deeply, if everybody leads, that implies that everybody follows from time to time. Okay? If everybody leads from time to time in different ways, everybody follows from time to time in different ways. Okay? Depending on the context. And I will tell you more about the context in a second. So the idea is that knowing how and when to follow is equally important than knowing how and when to lead. Very different from management, right? Managers never follow. Okay? So knowing when to follow is equally important than knowing when to lead. Because it's constantly changing. Because it's constantly changing. So how come that somebody in a certain moment is more influential than other people? How come that suddenly that person in that context, in that moment, becomes the leading person and the others are very happy to follow? And then this thing disappears and another leader emerges half an hour later because it's a different context. Okay? So what is the difference? I mean, how that happens? And I believe that there are three things that are relevant. One is the skills that you have if you're leading. One is the skills that you have for the task at hand. So if I take my car to the mechanic, it's because I trust his skills. I wouldn't take my car to a physician. Okay? I would go to a physician. I wouldn't take my car to a physician. Okay? Skills for the job at hand. Seniority on the task at hand. Okay? Sometimes we forget about seniority, but it's very important. If somebody has an expertise that has been developed for the last 5 years, 2 years, 20 years, probably that makes that person more relevant for leading for that specific thing. Okay? And the other thing is the responsibilities that somebody takes. And then we go back again to the idea of taking responsibilities. The true responsibility can only be taken. So if I want to take my car to a mechanic, I'm happy to choose someone who has good skills, has a lot of experience, and will take responsibility for what he does. For instance. This could be connected to formal position, but that's not really important at the moment. What I'm saying is that sometimes managers are appointed because they do have skills and experience. But let's keep management separate from leadership. Okay? Let's keep the two separate. So this morning when I was introducing the talk, I told you I also want to talk about the qualities, the personal inner qualities that help you in being a more useful leader and influence people. So I believe that this can be seen as different layers. For me, the outmost layer is your ability to communicate, which means not to impose your opinion, means your ability to listen and share and respect people. Okay? Your ability to have a vision, because if you want to bring about change, you need to know in which direction that change is supposed to happen. So you need to have a vision in abilities and be able to share those. That vision. On a more inner level, we have this idea of trustworthiness, meaning that if people trust you, they're more likely to follow you. Is that right? Okay. But I want to explore more this idea of trustworthiness in a few minutes. Olaf has a lot to say about building trust. I mean, he's the trust artist, right? And So talk to Olaf about building trust. But I'll tell you more about trust as well. If we go a bit deeper, other qualities that I believe are fundamental are truthfulness, which I will talk about, empathy. I don't need to describe what empathy is, taking personal responsibility, and having a mindset of non-self. Now, I want to be clear about this. I'm not telling you that you should let go of your ego, which you might want to do if you're on a spiritual path, but that's a different story. Okay, highly respected, but it's a different story. But if you're an organization, when I suggest that in your organization you might want to let go of your ego, or at least have a selfless mindset, I mean that I think it's very helpful for a leader to be able to have a systemic perspective, to see things not only from his or her own perspective, but being able to step out of yourself from a second and look at what really happens and see yourself in the picture. Okay, that's extremely important because it gives you a better understanding of, also it's more inclusive. You start to include in your own perception things that you would not see from the inside if you step out. Like, for instance, how people operate when you are there or when you are not there. Something that is an important piece of information. And at the core of that is this idea of awareness, which I mentioned earlier. If you're not aware of what's going on inside of you and outside of you, you're not making the right decision anyway. Whatever you do is probably not the right decision anyway, if you're not aware of what happens outside and inside of you. So let me explore a couple of these things. In terms of responsibility, one model which I like, is not the only one model which I like, is the personal responsibility model by Christopher Avery. If you're not familiar with that, I would suggest that you take a look. It's simple, but it's not simplistic. So let me say that again. It is simple, but it's not simplistic. Okay? Meaning that Christopher spent quite a few years, I think like 15 years, trying to understand what happens to us when we have a problem and how we react when we have a problem. And by problem, Christopher says that the problem is basically an obstacle between where you are now and where you want to be. Okay? I am here, I want to get there, and there's an obstacle. I want to be on time at work, and there is a queue on the freeway. Okay? I want to go to a meeting and be very well prepared, and then I get a phone call at the last minute, and I start being anxious, and then I'm not operating as I would like to. Okay? I would like to get there, but there's something that prevents me to do that. Or I would like to deliver on time, and we are late. Okay? I would like to deliver on time, but we are late. So what Christopher suggests is that there is this whole process that is basically wired into our mind, through which all of us go all the time, sometimes very quickly. So the first thing we do, for instance, when we have a problem, is the first reaction. Let's put it this way. To me, these are just strategies that the brain uses to get rid of the pain that you feel when you have a problem. Okay? To get rid of the pain, we apply some unconscious strategies. And the most basic, most primitive strategy is pretend it's not there. Pretend there is no problem. Okay? Which is why when something happens, people go, oh no. That's the first thing that you do, right? Okay. I'm going to be late. Oh no. Okay. Not going to happen. No, I'm sorry, it's going to happen. Okay. Laying blame. That's the second thing we do. Rather than taking pain on ourselves, we try to blame someone else and move the pain out of ourselves. Okay? Or making up excuses, justifications. Or if the problem we have is not only with us, but it's also visible to other people, like I'm going to be late in an important meeting. Okay? So people will know that I'm going to be late. You might feel ashamed. Or you might feel obliged to do something to make up for the fact that you are being late. Okay? But the thing is that none of these strategies are actually giving you the power of changing the situation. They're giving you the power of changing the present and or, more importantly, the future. Okay? So real responsibility is when you have the power of changing the present and the future, not the past. Sorry, there's no time machine that I know of. You cannot change the past, but you can change the present or the future. Okay? And I'll give you a quick example of how you can really get rid of all this stuff. One thing I've been doing way back in my life, I've been practicing skydiving for some time. And what's really interesting about skydiving is that if you jump out of a plane and your gear is malfunctioning, I assure you that you're not going to spend the last seconds of your life blaming someone or making up excuses, okay? Or feeling ashamed, oh, I'm so stupid, I'm so stupid, okay? Or feeling obligation, texting my wife in the last 15 seconds, sorry, I was stupid, I'm going to be dead soon. Love you. Okay. You get rid of all the bullshit immediately, right? Denial. Yes, denial. Oh, yeah, turn upside down. Oh, what a beautiful sky. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So you see what I'm talking about. Now, these things happen all the time. And it's very important that you become aware that if you want to take responsibility for what you do, when things go not as expected, it's very important that you take responsibility for things not going as you planned for, and not starting blaming, making up excuses, feeling obligated to do something for someone, feeling ashamed. Bullshit. Okay? Remember, skydiving. Okay? That's skydiving. So that's why taking responsibility, I think, is very important. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is this idea of truthfulness, being true, which is fundamental if you want to build trust. Okay? If you want to build trust. So for me, being true means a number of different things. I would just like to give a couple of examples, so maybe we can understand each other better. Do you guys know the technique, the communication technique called I language? You do? Of course you do. And so basically the idea is that when you need to talk about some conflict with someone, you talk in first person. Okay? You don't start pointing fingers. Okay. Oh, you were late. Okay. Yeah. You were late. No, you could say, you know, I've been waiting for you. I was expecting this meeting to happen 10 minutes ago, and now I have a problem. Okay? So you talk about you. Now, the I language is powerful, I think, because it combines two things that I've been talking about. One is awareness, okay? And the second one is that you talk about what is true. And the only thing that is true is what you know. And the only thing that you know is how you feel, okay? If you start making assumptions, or, you know, you're always late because you don't care, that's total assumption, okay? But when I say, you know, I've been here for 10 minutes and now I have a problem, okay? That's true, because that's the only thing that you really know, right? So that's why it works. The other thing is walk the talk. That's another way of being true, which means if you say something, you do something, okay? Walk the talk, walk the talk. And I've seen so many managers, Michael mentioned this this morning as well, so many managers, they say one thing and they do another, right? They give contradictory messages, okay? They say blah, blah, and they do woo, woo, okay? That's keeping promises. That's another way for me to be true. So if I tell you that I'll be there at 9 for our meeting, okay? That's a promise, and I'm supposed to keep the promise, okay? I made a commitment to be there. So if I need to break the promise, because that happens, okay, at least I will take responsibility, going back, I will take responsibility and try to do something. Okay, not because I feel obliged, not because I feel ashamed, okay, but because I take responsibility of not being able to meet my commitment. And that's another way of being true to people. And another one that could be interesting is depicting reality, meaning that for me, the definition of lying is when you project an image of something that you know to be different. Okay? So when you say or do something that gives somebody else a perspective that you know to be different from what it really is. Okay? Which is another way of being true. So you need this truthfulness to build trust, and you need trust. That's the second layer was trustworthiness, remember? But trust, in the way that I was talking about, also has another implication. To be trustworthy is actually connected to what we also call psychological safety. So when I'm talking about trust, I'm not talking about accountability or reliability. That's okay. Accountability or reliability. I'm not talking about if I tell you that I'm going to be there at 9, I will be there at 9. Okay? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about if I make myself vulnerable, if I need to call you and tell you, I'm sorry, man, I'm going to be 1 hour late. Okay? If I make myself vulnerable, I trust that you will not take advantage of my vulnerability. That's the kind of trust that we're trying to build. I trust that the people that work with me will support me, especially when I'm being vulnerable. Especially when I'm vulnerable. Okay? So, sorry man, I broke the build. Okay? Then of course there could be some kind of comments, blah, 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 because we also like to have fun at work and that's a good thing. But, sorry dude, I broke the build. Well, okay. Let's work about it. Let's do something. Okay? I trust that you will not insult me, be sarcastic, or blah, 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 for instance. Right? That's kind of trustworthiness I'm talking about. So which has nothing to do, as I mentioned, with reliability. Yeah. Now, if you're able to create this kind of context or way of working together, you might end up working in an environment where your leadership is actually distributed. Not only decision making is distributed, leadership is distributed, meaning that different people in different moments will provide what I like to call multiple synergistic acts of leadership. Multiple, because you have multiple people being leaders in different ways in different moments. So you have multiple of these acts of leadership. And they are synergistic because they are aligned. So alignment is another important thing. They are aligned to something that we want to achieve together. That's why they are synergistic. Okay. For instance, one way of creating a synergistic environment is saying, okay, in our team or our organization, one way of making decisions is that whenever I'm about to do something, okay, I'm going to commit now, I will just inform everybody I'm going to commit now, and if nobody complains, if everybody consent, then that's a go. We don't need to make a decision. That's a very simple way of creating synergistic act of leadership. But you can come up with smarter ones. If you're able to do this, I try to give you a graphical representation, but basically that's what it means, right? That different people in different moments have different spheres of influence. Sometimes they become influential as leaders, and then they become followers again, okay? And then they become leaders again, okay? Whenever the time is right, whenever the time calls for that, okay? So, what is this Agile leadership? I'll try to wrap it up, okay? I'll try to wrap up a couple of things that I mentioned. The purpose of Agile leadership is, as you can read, to enable agility in all organizational domains. Remember, I was talking about business agility, process agility, technical agility, and organizational agility. Okay, so that's the goal. The goal is to develop this kind of agility in all domains by relying on how we are as people when we are at our best. Okay, relying on how we are as people when we are at our best. Okay, and then foster, promote, cultivate those interactions that in fact are the nervous system of an agile organization. So then again, distributed decision making, respect, trust, blah 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 blah. And the agile leader, and then I'm done. Then again, everybody leads, everybody follows. Okay. The sphere of influence is contextual. I'm just trying to wrap up a couple of things I just would like you to remember. Remember the difference between management and leadership, because there is an overlapping, and that's another reason why people get confused. Okay? Sometimes there is an overlapping. To take Steve Jobs. Was Steve a leader or a manager, or both? Or to which degree? It was one or another. Okay? So there is overlapping, but what really helps you is to realize that leadership and management are still two different things. Even when they overlap, they are still two different things. And the work of a manager is not the work of a leader. Okay? And if you're able to create this continuous, multiple synergistics act of leadership, probably this is a better way to come up with good decisions rather than creating top-down decisional models and blah, 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 and stuff like that. I think I'm done. So, usual piece of information. I will post the slides next week on SlideShare. Just follow me on Twitter and or LinkedIn, and I'll ping you, and then you'll know where to find the slides, or just get in touch if you want to chat in general. And I'm done. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks. And I don't know if we have time for questions, but
we have a minute, probably. A minute.
Okay, good.
1 minute. Any questions, guys?
Thank you, Andrea. My question is, why are you so sure that managers in metric structure doesn't speak to each other?
Oh,
it was
right.
ironically in next slides, in subsequent slides, you told that not communicate is impossible.
No, I was kind of joking. I was exaggerating. Okay. What I'm saying is that usually in matrix organizations, I mean, there are matrix organizations because they represent two different functions of the organization. The two dimensions represent two different functions. Okay. And what I know by experience is that sometimes there is conflict between different functions. I'm talking about politics. I'm not talking about the model in general. I'm talking about practical politics that I see in organizations. Just the idea that if you have two different bosses, they have two different budgets, and they are fighting to get the attention of one resource, for instance. So that's why it's not a model per se, it's that it is very inclined to create awkward situations. But I don't have a scientific explanation, is my experience. Yeah. But you seem to have a different idea, and I would like to talk with you later if that's fine with you. Okay.
Yeah, I have one question. Is it possible to distinguish triggers that can explain that leadership in the team can be improved? Are there any triggers that show this? Are there any triggers that show that leadership in the team can be improved? Like.
Oh, you mean you said triggers?
Triggers, yeah. It's like some.
Oh, measure. How to measure leadership? Oh, that's a good question. My first question would be, why do you want to measure it? I'm sorry, I know it sounds fair, but it sounds unfair. But
how to find these proofs?
Okay. Well, I'm really scared that you guys want to have KPIs on leadership, because I don't think that's the right way to go.
Sure, we do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that these are decisions that should be made inside the organization. For instance, if you really want numbers, which I'm not sure is a good idea, you could count, for instance, how many people, how many times decisions are made collectively rather than delegated because there is a crisis and we need to escalate to someone else. That's one thing. Because I've seen situations where when the times get rough, people are not able to work out a decision together, and they escalate the decision to someone else, meaning that they abdicate their power of being leaders. They abdicate and give the power to someone else because they're not able to sort it out. Okay, so you could count that. How many times do we abdicate? Yeah. Something else. Let's talk later. Okay, let's talk later.
Okay, we have to finish.
Yeah? Yeah, delegation poker is another one. Yes. Yeah. We're done.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll be around until tomorrow, so